of the audience. I'm not sure I belong in the audience. And I thank you and apologize in advance for not being as electrifying as Sir Hilary will be in his own presentation. I would like to recognize, if you allow me, in addition to the members of the head table, I'd like to recognize Dr. Garvey, because I believe that last month was the 100th anniversary of the Right Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey's formation of the UNIA, which is one of the pillars upon which Pan-Africanism and our current views on reparations has been built. So I'd like to recognize Dr. Garvey. Luckily, they knew that I was not the Prime Minister, so they gave me a very narrow topic to talk about, and I think I'll stay in my lane. And that is to give background on the Caribbean communities, which is CARICOM, on our reparations initiative and its priority as government policy for St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the wider Caribbean. Each year, at around this time, Caribbean leaders join other presidents and prime ministers in convening in New York to participate in the annual United Nations General Debate. And each year, the countries gathered at the United Nations feel compelled to speak out against current and historical injustices, from genocide, to torture, to terrorism, to forced displacement of populations. From war crimes to crimes against humanity, from the Ukraine to Somalia to Palestine. And the countries of CARICOM, despite or maybe because of our small populations and lack of military might, have viewed ourselves as the conscience of the international community. We see ourselves as unencumbered by the historical baggage and geopolitical ambitions of other countries. We see our status as outsiders, one step removed from the inner sancta of international intrigue, as allowing us to call a spade and to be honest brokers in the quest for peace, justice, and development. Yet, historically, there has been one inescapable blot on this rather flattering self-portrait. At our highest political levels, we were neither fully confronting the myriad legacies of slavery on our citizens and national development, nor were we collectively acting in pursuit of reparatory justice. The old Caribbean admonition was apt, and I know that there's a Jamaican in the crowd, so dance a yard before you dance abroad, which means deal with injustices in your backyard before you prescribe solutions to similar wrongs in other far-flung locations. The path from slavery to de jure freedom in the English-speaking Caribbean traversed through a number of abolitions. First, the British abolished the slave trade, then slavery itself, and then a period of what they called apprenticeship, which was sort of slavery light, that allowed former shareholders to continue extracting free labor from former slaves. After the abolition of slavery, Her Majesty's government compensated the Caribbean slave holders in the sum of £20 million for the loss of their human property. Dr. Beckles, I believe the full estimate was about 47 million at the time. So they got a discount. In today's US dollars, that would be somewhere north of $3 billion. In tiny St. Vincent and the Grenadines, British slave owners received £592,509 for the 22,997 slaves that were there, or roughly in the neighborhood of $50 to $70 million for that property. Mind you, over the course of 45 years, between 1764 and 1808, at least 62,176 slaves left the coast of West Africa destined for a principal place of landing in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 62,000 plus. But by 1834, fewer than 23,000 remained. The dead or infirm did not appear in the compensation ledger book. Presumably the slaveholder had gotten his money's worth from those human beings that he worked through a harrowing life to a premature grave. And I know that this is not necessarily the forum that I need to detail painstakingly the horrors of slavery, because this audience knows it. But in our quest to make reparations seem logical and rational and reasonable, we should never divorce ourselves from the visceral memories and moral outrage that must always fuel our quest for justice. But St. Vincent and the Grenadines' modern realities were indelibly scarred even prior to the massive injustices of slavery and the slave trade. Before the arrival of the British to our shores, our country was populated by the indigenous Kalinago people and the Garifuna, who were the offspring and descendants of the Kalinago natives and escaped or shipwrecked Africans who made it to St. Vincent and the Grenadines from neighboring islands. The Garifuna fiercely resisted British conquest and fought 2 wars against the colonizers. The first war, which was a stalemate, culminated with one of the earliest treaties ever concluded between the British and an indigenous population in this hemisphere. The second war produced an unspeakable genocide, in which most of the surviving Garifuna were rounded up, placed on ships, and deported from their own lands to a series of inhospitable locales, finally settling off the coast of Honduras. The natives that were allowed to remain on St. Vincent saw their collective landholding reduced from 100,000 acres to under 250 acres of the most inhospitable territory in the country at the foot of an active volcano. There is little that I have to say here in the United States about the historical and present-day consequences of land grabs, forced displacement, and genocide of native populations. So I leave that there. But this history, first of native genocide, and then of a mode of production dependent on the enslavement of Africans, has bequeathed St. Vincent and the Grenadines an awful continuing legacy. From family roles and structures, to health, to poverty, to education, ambition, and self-esteem, the legacy has produced a population that to this day, I'm going to use a phrase that stuck with me from Mr. Coates' brilliant article, to this day, a population that is ecologically distinct. Nationally and regionally, slavery and native genocide left St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the wider Caribbean on the wrong side of a developmental chasm that runs between the countries that were exploited by the slave trade and those that received the benefit of a 400-year head start. On one side of the chasm, national governments are occupied with primary education. How can we get our children into primary school? On the other side, universities and institutions of higher learning. On one side of the gorge, nations worry about clinics and basic medication and maternal mortality. On the other side, expanding hospitals and advanced medical and pharmaceutical research. On one side are the borrowers and accumulators of unsustainable national debt, and on the other are the lenders and the dictators of terms and conditions. The socio-economic legacy of slavery among nations is self-evident. Almost no country that was either a source or destination for enslaved Africans has moved from the periphery to the core of the global economy since the abolition of slavery. Those nations that are currently managing the difficult transition from developing to developed nation, countries like China and India and Singapore, have many challenges to overcome. But thankfully, the legacy of African slavery is not one of them. Which brings us to the issue of CARICOM's historic reparatory justice initiative, its urgency and importance as governmental priority in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. For decades, Caribbean artists, intellectuals, and religious groups, particularly the Rastafarian community, have been beating the drum of global reparatory justice. The Caribbean's history of activism and toil in the vineyard of racial justice is long and proud, starting with war heroes like Nani of Jamaica and Chatoye of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, through Marcus Garvey and Kwame Ture, to notable Americans of Caribbean descent like Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. Yes, we claim them too. But the sustained, focused priority given to reparatory justice by politicians, by heads of state and government in the Caribbean is a relatively new phenomenon. Within the last decade, a number of Caribbean leaders, beginning with the former Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and the current Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, began to raise the claim of reparatory justice at the United Nations. To them and to their colleagues, the facts of native eradication and African slavery fit squarely within the modern definitions of genocide, torture, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Caribbean leaders began to highlight the self-evident but inconvenient truths of a legacy of poverty and underdevelopment in fields of public health, education, employment, and other manifestations of structural and social inequality. They question why the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was not being applied to the glaring historical consequences of native genocide and slavery in the Caribbean. These questions and international advocacy led in July of 2013 to the historic unanimous decision of all CARICOM leaders to set up national committees on reparations to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by former colonial European countries for the crimes of native genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and the system of chattel slavery in and of itself. And in many ways, that idea would have been inspired by Congressman Conyers' visionary work with HR 40, from which all governments, I believe, take their lead. And thank you again for that initiative. A Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations was established, ably led by the Prime Minister of Barbados. 2 months after that, St. Vincent and the Grenadines hosted the Caribbean community's first regional reparations conference, a watershed 3-day event that produced a regional reparations commission headed by Sir Hilary Beckles and charged with developing a regional roadmap to pursue reparatory justice. That commission proceeded to identify 6 key areas for diplomacy and action, and further refined those broad areas into a 10-point Caribbean reparatory justice program, on which Professor Beckles will no doubt elaborate. The Caribbean reparatory justice program, in turn, was endorsed by the heads, the Prime Ministers and Presidents of the Caribbean community in March of 2014, a meeting that also took place in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's a lot of work in 1 year. But much more has been done. Separate national reparations commissions in most Caribbean countries are hosting a series of public events to engage, educate, and learn from local communities as we sharpen our reparatory focus. The resulting elevation of national and regional consciousness on this issue, in and of itself, will be the first victory in the process of reparatory justice. The diplomatic engagement with the former colonizers and enslavers has also begun. Last June, at a CARICOM United Kingdom forum in London, and on behalf of the CARICOM foreign ministers, I raised the issue of reparatory justice with William Hague, who was then the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. We indicated that CARICOM expects this issue to be the subject of formal discussion between our region and the United Kingdom. Sir Hilary himself stood in the halls of the British House of Commons, which is ground zero for the architecture of Caribbean chattel slavery, and enunciated our claim with passion and logic, even naming the names of various current members of the British House of Lords, whose familial wealth was not only made in the Caribbean, but whose foreparents enslaved Sir Hilary's direct ancestors. But there is more. Many national parliaments, including Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, have passed motions that give legislative impetus to the principles, priorities, and processes necessary to pursue reparatory justice. CARICOM leaders have secured the services of a British law firm that has some experience in making claims of a reparatory or restitutional nature. That law firm, which recently engineered a £20 million settlement for the surviving Kenyan victims of British atrocities in the Mau Mau Rebellion of the 1950s, has worked with Caribbean lawyers in preparing a draft notice of complaint which sets out the legal case for reparatory justice under international law and practice. I know that there in this crowd are some brilliant and fetching lawyers, and I would hope that they also would find it among themselves, within themselves, to contribute to the legal arm of the argument for reparations against colonizers. The initial British arguments in the Mau Mau case and the Foreign Secretary's own responses to my request for a discussion on the issue signal that the Caribbean's quest for reparatory justice may not continue to advance with the rapidity that it has over the past 14 months. In no particular order, the British have raised the issue of how much time has elapsed since slavery, the evidentiary bases of who should be paid and how much they should be paid, of the fact that we are attempting to retroactively define as criminal acts that were legal at the time that they were committed, and even, incredibly, that any claims related to British atrocities should now be lodged against the successor governments in the now independent countries. In other words, the Kenyan victims should now make claims against the current Kenyan government for the crimes committed by British colonial authorities. More fundamentally and practically, I have heard at the highest levels that any conversation on reparations is politically unpalatable and may be even suicidal to governments that have to answer to electorates in a post-crisis environment of economic austerity. I'm sure that Congressman Conyers would have heard similar arguments as he tries to round up co-sponsors over the years for HR 40. Better yet, they tell us to try to secure some ill-defined promises of assistance or preferential treatment than to go forth with reparations. Even better, I have been told that we should recall not just the evils of genocide and slavery, but also the positive legacies that we have gained from the experience. Democracy, Christianity, and a strong command of the English language, to name but a few. Some of these arguments are mimicked in our respective local contexts. Mr. Coates' Atlantic article alludes to many of the questions raised by those more preoccupied with the practicalities as opposed to the inherent justice of the reparatory cause. I suspect that those practicalities are even more vexing in the United States, where conventional wisdom conceptualizes American reparations as an internal battle of African Americans seeking justice against their own government, as opposed to the Caribbean paradigm of nations predominantly descended from slaves and indentured laborers seeking justice from external colonial exploiters. But whether reparatory justice is styled as individual African Americans cashing in on General Sherman's 1865 guarantee of 40 acres of tillable ground to each freed African American family, or Caribbean governments enumerating 6 areas of responsibility that European governments are morally and legally bound to fulfill, the process begins with analysis, education, and conversation. It's been at least 13 years since I got out of law school here in DC, but HR 40 to my eyes doesn't appear to be remotely close to quantifying any dollar amount or any type of reparations required in the American context. It seeks to examine primarily, as it says in its own text, the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and subsequent discrimination against black people in this country. Similarly, nothing yet done by the Caribbean Reparations Commission attempts to aggregate or delineate any precise dollar figure or contours of any reparatory settlement. None of us are there yet. CARICOM's next step, internally and with the former slave trading European nations, involves conversation, not confrontation. Our initial engagement can only be adversarial if one party is attacking and the other is defending. But we cannot imagine any sane person defending the crime of slavery or the atrocities committed against native and enslaved populations. Nor do we think that it is possible for reasonable minds to differ on the fundamental point that the repercussions of slavery and native genocide continue to have profound negative effects on present-day individuals and nations. The commencement of these good faith conversations is an important litmus test of the strength of the Caribbean's friendship and cooperation with our long-standing European allies. We are aware of the full range of practical, political, and economic hurdles to a mutually acceptable reparatory settlement. But we shall not allow full sight of the forest of justice to be obscured by political trees and bureaucratic branches. There is steel in the Caribbean spine on this issue, and the determination to bring it to head, whether diplomatically or legally or otherwise. The level of priority that CARICOM governments accord to the issue of reparatory justice cannot be overstated. At the deepest root of our region's historical developmental impediments is not our small size, it is not our vulnerable debt-saddled economies, it is not our general lack of natural resources, it is not even our susceptibility to climate change, which is indeed an existential threat. No, these are all significant factors with which we must grapple, but it is the enduring legacy of slavery that has been the unchanging developmental millstone that we have been forced to carry uphill for generations. My favorite artist, Bob Marley, sang a song called Slave Driver. And there are 4 lines in there that begin the song. He says, every time I hear the crack of a whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized my very soul. And slavery and the slave ship was beyond an indignity. It was beyond barbarism. It was beyond inhuman. It was, apart from the physical atrocities, a brutalization of the psyche of a people. So violent and enduring that it has created a shared cultural memory of the trauma. A collective memory that lives so vividly in the souls of those who have died that it is bequeathed to those of us who live today and those yet unborn. For the CARICOM member states, it is a scar that is 15 countries wide and 400 years deep. For the world, it remains a festering sore on the conscience of humanity. I know those scars are felt and shared and understood by millions of African American brothers and sisters. That is why our leaders have instinctively and independently embarked on such similar reparatory paths. The ties that bind us are deep and unbreakable. The legacies that shape us are shared, and the solidarity that informs our quest to study, educate, advocate, and obtain justice must not be simply assumed, it must be vigorously lived. As we support your efforts to move forward with HR 40 and the just cause of reparations in the United States, so too we do solicit your active kinship, assistance, and support. This is a great cause of our generation, and great causes are not won by timid, fractious men and women. Together, we can and we will succeed. Thank you very much.